Look at this landmass. This is Eben Atoll, an isolated coral reef in the Marshall Islands. On January 30th, 2014, a heavily emaciated man washed ashore on these shallows. His physical condition indicated extreme environmental exposure. He suffered from severe sun damage, late-stage starvation, and was wearing nothing but the shredded remains of an undervest. This photograph shows the man discovered that day, Jose Salvador Alvarenga. Upon rescue, he made a staggering claim. He stated he had been drifting continuously on the open ocean for 439 days. The spatial math of his claim was equally extreme. He stated his drift originated off the coast of Mexico, a distance of over 8,000 kilometers from where he was found. He claimed to have crossed this massive geographic expanse in a 7-foot open skiff, entirely devoid of navigation equipment or structural shelter. Local authorities and global media immediately rejected the story. The consensus was that fabricating the event was more probable than surviving it. The skepticism was rooted in strict biology. Established medical survival models dictate that human organ failure occurs rapidly without a dedicated fresh water supply, making a 14-month oceanic drift theoretically impossible. If Alvarenga's survival is an anomaly, proving it requires stripping away the narrative and applying a strict analysis to his environmental inputs and outputs. To verify his account, we must deconstruct 3 specific metrics: the mechanical trajectory of his drift, his localized metabolic harvesting methods, and his psychological endurance. Surviving the Pacific Ocean is a quantifiable event. It requires analyzing extreme biological adaptation and physical drift mechanics under absolute isolation. The mechanical timeline begins on November 17, 2012, approximately 120 kilometers off the coast of Costa Azul, Mexico.
The crew consisted of 2 men, Alvarenga, a highly experienced fisherman, and a single companion. Their operational parameters were highly localized. They provisioned for a standard 30-hour commercial fishing window. This photograph illustrates the class of skiff they operated. Note the severe hardware limitations: 0 structural shelter, a single cooler, and 1 outboard motor. The operation was disrupted by a severe, undocumented storm system. Ocean surface conditions deteriorated rapidly, forcing an immediate retreat. To maximize return speed and keep the skiff buoyant, they executed an emergency weight reduction protocol, actively dumping all their heavy fishing nets and tackle into the ocean. The catastrophic mechanical failure occurred a fraction of a degree away from safety. Just 20 kilometers from the coastline, their sole outboard engine completely died. They utilized their final backup system, a 2-way radio, to ping their employer with their location. Immediately after transmitting the coordinates, the radio battery depleted. This map tracks the immediate physics of the aftermath. Storm force winds and prevailing currents hijacked the lightweight hull. Within 5 days, these forces pushed the unpowered skiff 450 kilometers out into the open Pacific. While the men's employer deployed a localized search party based on that final radio ping, the sheer speed of their outward drift mathematically rendered the search grid useless. They were already hundreds of kilometers beyond its borders. With mechanical propulsion and communication destroyed, active navigation ended. The 2 men were now entirely subordinate to pelagic fluid dynamics. Out on the water, the primary biological ticking clock is dehydration. Exposed to constant wind and heat, human fluid reserves evaporate rapidly. Consuming the surrounding ocean is lethal. Seawater has an extreme salinity level. Drinking it triggers hypernatremia, a condition where the body pulls water out of its own cells to dilute the salt, leading to rapid, fatal kidney failure. This flowchart demonstrates their first physiological adaptation. They repurposed the empty fish cooler and scattered plastic bottles, using the boat's fiberglass deck as a catchment surface to harvest and store sporadic rainwater. Water was only half the equation. The 2 men faced a severe caloric deficit, having depleted their 30-hour supply of prepackaged food just 2 days after the storm hit. Extracting protein from the ocean was severely complicated by their emergency protocols during the storm. Having abandoned their nets, they possessed no standard tools to pull biomass from the water. They developed an opportunistic hunting method. By remaining perfectly still, they allowed themselves to bare-hand trap seabirds that landed on the skiff's gunwales. But rainwater is inconsistent.
During extreme drought periods, relying on precipitation was a mathematical guarantee of organ failure. They required an alternative hydration source. Their secondary fluid extraction method relied entirely on captured fauna. They survived dry stretches by cutting open turtles and fish and consuming their raw blood. Consuming raw, untreated marine blood requires breaking a massive psychological barrier. The body instinctively rejects it, yet overcoming that nausea is mandatory to maintain base metabolic function. Escaping biological failure in an environment with zero infrastructure requires systematically stripping away societal food norms. Local fauna can no longer be viewed as animals, but strictly as mechanical units of hydration and protein. As the timeline extended into months, currents dragged the skiff into a region of the Pacific known as the Silent Zone, a massive oceanic void completely bypassed by commercial cargo routes. This photograph visualizes the environmental reality of that coordinates grid: total sensory deprivation. There is no land, no ships, and no variance in the horizon. Inside the boat, the conditions created a severe psychological pressure cooker. 2 starving men were confined to a 7-foot flat surface, absorbing a continuous, unbroken existential threat. The first catastrophic psychological shock occurred at the 4-month mark. Alvarenga's companion failed to adapt to the brutal metabolic reality. The visceral toll a diet, specifically the inability to continually consume raw marine blood, broke his endurance. Unable to process the physical torture, his psychological framework collapsed, resulting in his death. This death removed the final buffer of social interaction. Alvarenga was now forced to manage the physical maintenance of the skiff and his own declining mental state in absolute, unbroken isolation. 2 months later, at the half-year mark, a second major psychological shock occurred. A massive cargo ship finally breached the horizon line. Because Alvarenga lacked flare guns, mirrors, or any standardized reflective materials, his 7-foot boat remained entirely invisible to the passing vessel. He watched the only rescue opportunity in 6 months slowly disappear. Processing that visual data requires an immediate internal cognitive reboot to prevent the brain from shutting down survival protocols. While the physical body runs on calories and water, survival longevity is ultimately capped by the mind's ability to compartmentalize consecutive, catastrophic traumas. Fast forward to day 439, January 30th, 2014. The skiff had now traveled over 8,000 kilometers from its launch point. The pelagic monotony finally broke. Alvarenga observed a distinct shift in the surrounding debris field, specifically noting floating coconuts bobbing in the water. A second environmental indicator confirmed the shift. The sparse presence of deep-sea birds was replaced by a sudden concentration of coastal birds, altering their flight patterns above his head. The skiff eventually drifted into the shallow, solid reefs of Eben Atoll. Alvarenga abandoned the hull, jumping into the water and swimming the remaining distance to solid ground. After securing his footing on the island, he was discovered by a local resident. The Marshall Islands police were dispatched to execute a formal extraction. His arrival triggered intense bureaucratic and media backlash. A 14-month survival claim in a vessel of that size defied all established empirical data. The situation was severely complicated by legal action. The family of his deceased companion filed a lawsuit, formally accusing Alvarenga of surviving through cannibalism. Authorities initiated a rigorous forensic verification process. Investigators contacted his former employer in Mexico, successfully confirming the exact November 2012 disappearance date. Next, they cross-referenced environmental data. Meteorologists matched historical 2012 storm records to the initial displacement vector that pushed the skiff off the coastline. This final timeline tracks the oceanographic validation. Scientists proved that the prevailing currents act as a conveyor belt, logically routing passive debris from Mexico directly to the Marshall Islands over a 438-day span. Cleared of the charges and validated by the data, Jose Alvarenga's drift stands as a rigorously documented case study. It proves that human biological resilience, when forced to execute absolute first-principle resource extraction, can outlast the most pessimistic models of oceanic isolation.